sustainability policy. She is someone who thinks very much about at the intersections of engineering and public policy, and is an expert in energy resilience in that context. Is also an associate director for our newly to be announced, you heard it here first, Global Resilience Institute. And that gets me to our third panelist, Steve Flynn, who is professor of political science, and in fact the director of the Global Resilience Institute that you will see announced by Northeastern University in the next month or so. Also someone like the others who very much is interested in thinking about the significance of governance in the face of man-made as well as natural disasters, someone who has always thought at the intersections of policy and technology. And I would just say also has a book that has a title that I think resonates with us. There's more than one book, but the title that I find particularly resonant is the subtitle that comes to me first. I have to look through my notes, so you'll have to give us the title once I tell you, Steve. It's Rebuilding a Resilient Nation, but I believe the title is actually On the Edge of Disaster.
The Edge of Disaster. There we go.
The edge
we can't see any relevance to the actual topic.
In any case, I think you will all agree that even as we might not agree politically, that there are very important questions that are in front of us, and that the values that we hold dear in the liberal arts are in fact important in this moment. And I want to just say one more thing that I really is very important. We can have lots of room for disagreements, lots of room for compromises, but where we can't compromise is we cannot allow bigotry to be a part of the ways in which we interact in this world today. So with that, let me please ask you to join me in welcoming our panelists.
Okay, thank you very much, Jutta. Let me also add my thanks to John DiBiase for hosting this. He's an alumnus from the political science department. So that deserves So I think what I would like to do, we have some interesting conversation that we can have this evening. My job is to just kind of get it started, and I think the three of these three will take it and move along with it, and hopefully we'll have some opportunities for some comments, questions from the audience as well. Let me frame it just very quickly. It's a little dangerous at this point to talk about a transition in an administration. We have a newly elected president-elect who is appointing various people to cabinet level positions. The title of this presentation was The First 100 Days. They haven't started yet. That comes later, about a month from now, when those first 100 days start. But this is a tricky time to talk about an administration, and particularly when you're moving, I think most people would understand or would agree, from something that is over here to something that's quite different coming January 20th. So there's just some minefields here, perhaps, to look at. And also to recognize we're going from running for office to governing in office. And elections are one thing, governing is a very different thing. Elections are about making differences, identifying differences, making yourself different. Governing is about overcoming differences and bringing people together. So it's a very different kind of dynamic that we have here. And then just a word on this, thinking about this 100 days, which has been a phrase that's been used since FDR's time. That was the first time it was adopted for his first 100 days. It's the kind of a test of how will that administration do. A new administration comes into office, kind of how successful are they going to be in putting their imprint on what's going on in American politics. So FDR in 1933, quite successful, launched the New Deal. And that became kind of the beginning for his 100 days. People have applied it since then. Maybe if we go back 8 years to Barack Obama coming in, his first 100 days launched the stimulus package. People down here will remember. So that was a pretty successful 100 days. Now, one of the things that becomes characteristic there is they have both, the executive and the legislative branches are of the same party, and that certainly gives some oomph to that first 100 days. And we have that situation here as well, so we'll see where that goes. The other comment I want to make that I think is an interesting dynamic that will be unfolding is the kind of the relationship between the political appointees who come in, and by count I've seen, there are roughly 3,800 political appointees in the federal level who will be coming in, administering, kind of overseeing this vast federal bureaucracy, which has kind of gone a different direction than the new president wants to go. And so there's going to be a lot of dynamic there, and some of you are very involved with that yourselves or have seen that. And so I think that's also a very interesting place to look at and say, how successful will the new president be in kind of moving this big organization in a different direction. So let me start. I just want to kind of start with a rather broad question. I'm going to start with you, Governor, because you're sitting in the middle, and your name is on the invitation. So you expected to hear from him, so you need to hear from him. But the question, you may have some introductory comments if you want to make, but the question I'm posing in general is what do you see, and to the other panelists as well, what do you see as 3 or 4 of the top priorities for a Trump administration moving forward in that first 100 days, and what kind of success do you think they will have?
Well, I really think it's too early, because none of us really have a sense of this guy and who he is. Kind of bounces around a bit, and I don't say that disparaging. He's just an interesting guy with somewhat unformed political philosophy. And he's never been in a job like this. And there's something to be said for some experience in a job like this, especially when you're dealing with critical issues both at home and abroad. Let me just say a word or two, John, about what happened here. And of course, I don't know any more than you do. And let me also say, John, thanks to you, one of my first students at Northeastern since 1981. And I also want to say thanks to you guys who surprised me by inviting my beautiful granddaughter. Now, stand up. Who is now a producer at ABC News. I hope one of these days it's going to emerge on your television screen. Doing great things. It is already. And it's a great surprise to have her with us. I'm going to take all the kids and grandkids, Kitty and I, and we're going to go out to Mexico for about 6 days right after Christmas, because my dear wife is 80, if you can believe it. She's still the best looking Medicare recipient in America. Just talked to her, she sounded great. But, she's 80, man. Her husband's older than she is. But just a few thoughts, John, try to keep as brief as I can, of reflection. This is not the first time, folks, we've been through an interesting and maybe difficult period. I think I'm probably the only person in the room who lived through Joe McCarthy. Anybody else? Just a couple of us. The 50s were a very, very tough period for us. This McCarthy thing, the McCarthyism thing was real. And I experienced some of it myself. I was this Greek kid from Boston who decided to go to a place I had never heard of called Swarthmore College, 9 miles outside of Philadelphia. A Quaker school. I didn't know a Quaker from a Shaker. And I'd never been out of New England. In those days, you didn't jump on a plane to go places. I'd been in other parts of New England. I'd never been out of New England. And I found myself 9 miles southwest of Philadelphia at this place called Swarthmore, only to discover that the barber shops in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania wouldn't cut the hair of black kids in Swarthmore. That was the US of A in those days, folks. This is Philly, not Birmingham, this is Philadelphia. And by the way, people of color could not live in the town of Brookline in 1951. Or any place on the northeastern side of the railroad tracks. They could work over here, but they had to go back over there to go home. I mean, Boston itself racist, anti-Semitic. We have a wonderful other grandchild, the second one to Allie, who very much wants to go to Tufts. And you'll hear on early admission sometime the next couple of days. A great kid, and he's a terrific tennis player. He's one of the two best high school tennis players in Colorado. And he and his father play in the father and son's tournament, which is at Longwood, the national father and son's tournament. And the first time he came out to do that, Kitty was driving him up to Longwood, tried to explain to him that when she was his age, she couldn't step foot on a tennis court at Longwood because she was Jewish. I mean, that's when America was great, in case you. And the McCarthy thing was very, very scary. People's patriotism was being questioned. We had words floating around like subversive and fellow traveler and pinko, and there's a whole vocabulary. So I'm this Greek kid. I go down to Swarthmore, have a very good 4 years, get pretty active politically. And 6 weeks after I graduate and come back to Boston, I'm at the Fargo School, swearing allegiance to the United States, and getting on a train with a motley group of 30 others and going to Fort Dix, New Jersey for my first 8 weeks basic training. 3 years after I got there, I had what was supposed to be a personnel interview, 5 minutes, and then they decided what you were going to do for the next 2 years. Except my personnel interview, another draftee, by the way, was a guy named Harry Kane III. Who knows who Harry Kane Jr. was? C-A-I-N. If you get this right, you're not taking the final. Harry Kane Jr. was the right-wing McCarthyite United States Senator from the state of Washington. And I think Scoop Jackson defeated him. And I'm being interviewed by Harry Kane's kid, Harry Kane III, who has a file, folks. This is a pre-computer America, on me, with every single political activity that I had ever engaged in before he was out of school. So the interview starts like this. So you ran a fundraising drive for the American Civil Liberties Union when you were at Salem. I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I did. And you were the chairman of the SDA. That was the Students for Democratic Action, the student wing of the ADA. Then I was succeeded by a guy named Carl Levin.
Business person.
Armed Services Committee.
Yeah, exactly.
And it went on like this, folks. Now, fortunately, he didn't recommend me for an honorable discharge, which they were doing to some draftees. And he sent me to Korea, which was okay. Where do you think they got that information? If they had it on me, they must have had millions of these files, don't you think? The FBI, we learned later, years later, the FBI had a tap on the Swarthmore switchboard. And all phone calls went through that switchboard. And so they must have been recording every single conversation and making up dossiers. That's Greek kids from Boston. So we've been through some very tough periods, which doesn't mean I feel great about this. I thought we were making some progress. But I do think this, and then, John, maybe I'll get on to your question. I think my party has got to start getting serious about organizing this country on a 50-state basis and get out of this red-blue narrative. I mean, I took West Virginia by 12 points, Iowa by 10. So how come they're red? What is this? What is this? And if you decide they're red, then you don't do anything there. And so you end up basically fighting over what? 6 or 7 states. While the rest of the country is just a spectator to all this. And let me tell you this, as a candidate, there's nothing more boring than spending nothing against the 6 or 7 so-called battleground states. Round and round. Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, maybe Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, maybe Missouri, over and over and over again for 2 months, folks. Not only that, but we still have an institution profoundly undemocratic and highly aristocratic, if I may say, called the Electoral College, which should have been abolished 175 years ago. I just got the latest numbers. Nobody won that election by 3 million votes. Somebody else is going to be the President of the United States, and I would say exactly the same thing. In fact, if the shoe had been on the other foot, and Trump had gotten 3 3 million more votes than Hillary, and she was preparing to go into the White House. I think we might have blood in the street. Think about it. Now, there's a way of getting rid of it. Some of you, I suspect, are fairly familiar with the Common Cause effort, the so-called National Party Vote thing. And we've got, states representing 175 and 270 required to vote to commit their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. It's a great way to get rid of the electoral college without having to amend the Constitution. And I hope a lot of people are going to be working on that, because this is kind of ridiculous. And I would say the same thing if the shoe had been on the other foot. If John Kerry had gotten 50,000 more votes in Ohio, he would have become the President of the United States, even though Bush had a margin of 3 million. Equally unacceptable. But I do think the fate of the Democratic Party to organize on a 50-state basis and to get off this red-blue thing has not only been hurting us, it's been killing us at the state and local level. And that's equally unacceptable. So I hope my party is going to get itself a first-rate, full-time national chairman who devotes himself or herself exclusively to getting this party back on track in all of the 50 states. We had a guy named Howard Dean as national chairman, you recall, who ran a 50-state campaign, despite the fact that some members of Congress, including the current mayor of Chicago, gave him a very hard time, and that's the last time the Democrats won the Congress. Something to think about. Quick one on Johnson, and I'm really much more interested in listening to these folks than listening to myself. The economy is always the single most important issue in the campaign and beyond. I think the national economy is doing remarkably well, given the pit we were put in 8 years ago. And in point of fact, ironically, Trump is going to inherit what will be an increasingly, I think, stronger and stronger economy, which doesn't mean that there aren't certain parts of the country that need a lot of work, and I'm, as many of you know from the work I've done in Massachusetts, I'm a great believer in regional development strategy, which focuses on some of these particular parts of my state, or in this case the country, that need special treatment. And we know there, I mean, the coal states are in serious decline, even before we got concerned about climate change. And I think the national government's got to focus on those states and others that have special problems. And I'm not sure, I've admired the presidents, I'm not sure he and his administration did that very well. Had they, I think it might have been a very different result. And of course I'm concerned about our foreign policy, which is bothering the hell out of me these days. I don't think American interventionism is working. That may be the understatement of the night. And this notion that somehow we are going to be the hegemon of the world, I think ought to be scrapped. Now, I happen to be a big UN fan. That may sound quaint to you, but quite frankly, I think we've got to be dealing with these problems in a collective way, internationally, and for better or for worse, that's the UN and its constituent agencies. And in point of fact, and people just don't remember this, there was a time 5 years ago, and some of you may recall, Ban Ki-moon asked Kofi Annan to come out of retirement and become a mediator in the Syrian situation. And Kofi Annan went to work for 11 months and put together a process that was designed to lead to the gradual democratization of Syria, and Assad bought into it and put together a conference to be held in Istanbul with 16 countries to begin that process. He invited Iran, without whom you can't have a settlement in Syria. And we found out about it and said, if Iran's going, we're not going. And blew up the conference. And look what we got. So this is too, we can't get into the details of the thing. All I can tell you is this, folks. I don't think the United States can be the world's policeman. A, it doesn't work. B, we can't afford it. Nobody, by the way, is talking about budget deficits. Have you noticed? We have a $500 billion deficit, an $18 trillion in the form of national debt. You know, I used to describe myself as a liberal who could count. Really very concerned. And we're going to cut taxes. We're going to spend a lot of money in infrastructure. And as we've all discovered, in the end, it'll work out because supply-side economics will work again. It hasn't, it never will. It's not going to. And I got to tell you, John, I'm very concerned about where all of this is going, but I assume that part of this is going to involve deep tax cuts and big investment in infrastructure. I'm for that, especially with high-speed trains. And I don't know where all this is going, but I have a feeling it's Reagan v. Ducks, and that bothers me. That bothers me. Let me stop at that point. I've gone on too far.
Okay.
So it is.
Well, let me keep moving on. Just kind of the same general question of what are the, and what do you see as some of the priorities for a Trump administration that first 100 days? What are they going to try to do, and what are the prospects? Steve, so Steve is kind of more on the security side, Jenny particularly on the environment side. Steve, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. You know, I can speak to this from a couple of perspectives. I had the opportunity to serve on President Obama's transition team in 2008 and 2009 with the Homeland Security Policy portfolio. But my background is a retired Coast Guard officer, and I've served both in the Bush White House and the Clinton White House, and so dealing with security as traditionally a very nonpartisan issue. It was one thing, I think, during the Cold War where, I mean, the 50s is the really extreme case here, but as it evolves, it's pretty much, you can have enormous respect and often not tell much difference between a Democrat and a Republican when it came to sort of core national security. And certainly some of the folks that I was able to interact with early in my career, sort of the elder statesmen, that this was truly nonpartisan territory. But we moved into a different space, clearly, here in this election cycle. One, I guess I just have to say frankly, what I think we saw was a significant exploitation, and that's the only way I can put it here, of fear, of playing to people's fears. And that seemed to work for the president-elect. I mean, he got a lot of mileage out of that. And you would think, as you said, when we moved to governance, to actually governing, we're going to bring people together. There's enough things to really be afraid about without creating artificial fears, that we'd start to see some of that toning down. I don't see much evidence, though, already of that happening. So my full academic training is in presidential crisis decision making. And so one of the things that gives me particular pause, having served in the National Security Council, having done a deeper dive on this in the post-Second World War era, is that the place where there's the fewest checks and balances in our system is really when it comes to truly national security decisions. At the end of the day, it's why we built the national security apparatus we have with the National Security Council in the White House. And we essentially provided the president with tools of communication and all the apparatus that you see, trimmings of Air Force One and the rest of it here is because of the command and control function that the president needs to play in times of great emergencies. And so this is not a place we get on the phone and chat a lot with a lot of folks when things get hot. This is where essentially, the president has enormous discretion to decide whether we go left or right or wherever. And therefore folks sort of closest to him obviously are enormously important in terms of the kinds of counsel they can provide. But they're almost always the really hard problems. And those are really the only problems that do end up in most presidents' desks, are ones where nobody near him are all in agreement. Right, so you have Secretary of State violently opposed to what the Secretary of Defense wants to do and vice versa. And it's all about judgment. And there's really only one belly button that can be pushed here to make that judgment. And so most presidents obviously take it very seriously about the need to be schooled up on this so they can exercise that judgment in those moments. And what's been particularly worrisome, obviously, in most recent days, of course, is I don't really need that daily television brief. I know what's going on. I have advisors who can sort of sit through all that kind of stuff here. And I mean, the world is a very challenging place, and the kinds of things that get end up on the president's desk are truly gray areas. They're not black and white, so those get solved easily somewhere else. And so that's an area, obviously, where I have significant pause. So I just would lay out here is, assuming that we don't have any real international crises or domestic crises that warrant the president to exercise judgment the first 100 days, there's some things I can project. But I just want to sort of lay out there as a liar is that most of the things that presidents end up getting known for are things that they didn't lay out in their 100-day plan, but are things that arose on their watch. And I would argue, Franklin Delano Roosevelt obviously deserves an enormous amount of credit getting us out of the Depression and all, but he's probably most well known for us historically for what he did in the Second World War. And that was really a time when world history was at a tipping point, and happily he took to the right way. So looking out there, just probably what I'm seeing, I've been down in DC a couple times since the election, inside sort of the baseball of this transition and watching it here. Most of it has been problematic to watch. The teams are just being put together basically to come in to do the hand of the baton. I really give President Bush an enormous amount of credit for actually thinking through this transition process. When the Obama team came in, there was a lot there to get briefed up on about what was going on. And people were very candid about, hey, this is working and this is not so working here. Good luck with that kind of thing. There was this sort of sense here, because I'm afraid the Clinton handoff was not so good. I mean, that was a fairly, well, one is, was a delay, obviously, as we recall, relative to when Bush was actually declared the winner. And I would say there was some sour grapes on the folks who were leaving, and they were really not, hey, good luck to the SOBs, there it is. But that was not what we had there. And President Obama, to his great credit, repeated that same approach. Whoever wins, we got to have this portfolio. But in most cases, it's a classic, there's the bride at the altar, but no groom is showing up here yet on that transition. And we're down to a few weeks, so that's certainly something that's really worrisome. Very clearly, I know the folks who are in political appointed positions, which actually people run most of the government, that's kind of the way we set it up, they've been told by the transition team that they only want to talk to the pre-civil servants. They don't want to talk to anybody who's got a Schedule C appointee or are appointed directly by the president, because obviously. So there's some real worrisome issues here relative to continuity. At its core, I would say, you can break a lot of things in 100 days. So, and if your goal is to break them, eliminate executive orders, eliminate initiatives and programs, the power of negation is a pretty powerful one in Washington. The power of constructively getting something done, now that's a lot of work. That requires making all these three branches of government work well, and a lot of cajoling and the rest of the pull people together. But if your agenda really is more negative than positive, they'll probably accomplish a lot in 100 days. That's not a very cheery one, but that's the time. Okay, you already have yours.
Well, I think I'm mic'd up. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Interesting point I think we'll come back to. You raised the notion or the idea that in the security area, there's few checks and balances. So I think if you think about the president and what they do, I think different parts of their portfolio have more checks on them than others, which is, I think, an interesting point. Jenny, you're kind of more in the environmental area. What do you see?
So yeah, my area is environment, sustainability, resilience, thinking about climate change in particular. My own work really is focusing on the renewable energy transition. So moving away from our predominantly fossil fuel-based society toward a more renewable-based society. And my perspective is that transition is happening. What the role the United States plays in that transition, in the next 4 years is to be determined. But one of the things that's really clear to me, and my own motivation for getting in this field obviously has been related to environment and concern about climate change and carbon emissions. But one of the things that I explore in my own research is all the other co-benefits of moving away from fossil fuels dominated society to a renewable-based society. And there's all kinds of things in terms of redistributing power, literally and figuratively. And when we think about the fossil fuel industry and the role that they have played in American politics, and that they now seem to be even more prominently playing, we can see some of the challenges of the fossil fuel-based system that we have. So some of the other benefits include jobs, community ownership, local resilience. If you think about distributed renewable energy systems, there's a lot of positive benefits there. So one of the things I was thinking about the question and speculating about the first 100 days, and I think I'm a little bit hesitant because there's so much uncertainty, so the way I would like to respond here is really to make kind of five, I thought about my remarks and thought about 5 main points that I want to make. And the first one and the last one are optimistic. The 3 in the middle are not so much. So I think we're all kind of grappling with this, whether it be despair or anger, frustration, maybe some optimism in terms of things are going to radically change, right? It seems like. So there's opportunities there for some real shifts in the way things have been in our society. So I think I'm sure all of you thinking about how you've reacted since the election. I found myself, I have 2 teenage daughters, and I found myself the first few days, they were very frightened and upset, and I found myself, my maternal instinct, telling them, oh, it's not that bad, it's gonna be okay, trying to encourage a positive perspective on, and that, change happens through convoluted ways, so maybe this is a good thing. So anyway, I thought about kind of my remarks in terms of that kind of optimism and pessimism, and I grapple with that with my students a lot too, because obviously in the area of environment, sustainability, and climate change, it's hard sometimes even before the election to be optimistic. So I want to start with, I have 5 points. The first one I wanted to say was just that with regard to renewable energy and the renewable energy transition, it is happening. This train has left the station and there's momentum, and renewable energy is being deployed all over the world, in the United States. Price of solar has plummeted. The subsidies can still help accelerate that, but they are not required. It makes economic sense. It creates jobs. Like, there's so many benefits. It's going to keep happening. So whatever happens at the federal level, renewable energy will still be a big part of the next 4 years in the United States. There are questions about the U.S. role and how we could actually lose ground with other countries advancing faster and investing more. But anyway, that's kind of an optimistic point. The renewable energy transition is happening. With regard to climate change, environmental protections, more broadly, obviously there's a lot of concern. A real kind of assault of all kinds of environmental protections are possible, seem likely. And ultimately with climate change, if we're not taking this issue seriously, the impacts will result in all kinds of devastation and suffering of people around the world, and the role the United States plays in that international sphere is very critical. So that is hard to be optimistic about, and particularly with the Secretary of State appointment as an ExxonMobil CEO. The Department of Energy was just announced, and then also, I don't know if you heard, the Department of Energy, there was a survey that the transition team asked of the Department of Energy, kind of asking specific names of people who've been involved in certain climate-related activities, which was very unusual and surprising for that kind of thing to go on. So that doesn't sound good. The third point, I think several of us have kind of echoed this, something that's very troubling is kind of this post-fact politics, right? Like a new era where information, data, analysis, science doesn't really matter. We don't, there claims to be made without justification of evidence, and given the complexity of all these issues, just going with your gut feeling on something, is very likely not to come up with a positive, productive decision. So that's a real concern. I also wanted to mention something about gender and diversity as my fourth point, where I'm not optimistic. Obviously, we saw a lot of concerns about diversity and misogyny and different perspectives and cultural hostilities throughout the campaign. Now with the cabinet appointments, we are seeing a lack of diversity, I guess, and so far I think there have been 3 women appointed in the cabinet, and I guess Nikki Haley, also the ambassador to UN. And it's not just the specific demographics, but there's also the men that have been appointed represent a particular type of masculinity that is kind of has this extractivist, kind of conservative, powerful, dominant ethos. That is, well, it's not just that. There's something particular. I guess what I'm saying is it's not just white men. It's something, a particular kind of masculinity that is being promoted and projected in the way by this president-elect that I think is troubling. So then for my 5th point, I want to end on something positive. That I think if you think about the environmental movement and the potential for change here, we can see that environmental politics are shifting, and I think there's actually reasons for some optimism in thinking about new alliances among different social movements with climate and environmental activists, connecting more explicitly with social justice and human rights and Black Lives Matters, and all these different movements kind of coming together in a very powerful alliances, and NGOs of all kinds are going to become more active and more involved, and there's going to be a lot of hard fighting, resistance to a lot of the appointments in the first 100 days. So there's a lot of momentum and movement that ultimately could result in some positive changes for society. So those are kind of my broad remarks. Let's get us started.
All right, thank you. Let me pick out 2 kind of initiatives that President-elect Trump has talked about quite a bit. I'm curious whether these will happen at all moving into the first 100 days. First, one is clearly repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And Governor, that would be something I know you could speak to in particular. But Republicans have been trying to do that for quite a while. Is that going to happen? What would that look like? The other is the wall. Excuse me, the immigration issue. Building a wall across with Mexico. Is that going to just die out and won't even make it into that first 100 days? If it does, what do you think would happen to it?
We'll have Steve talk about the wall.
I'll talk about the wall.
This healthcare thing is going to be a hell of a fight for a number of reasons. First, let me be subtle and say that I don't think there's anything dumber than the proposal to privatize Medicare. And there's nothing ideological about this. Medicare happens to have been one of the most successful things we've done, and it works extremely well. And it takes maybe 3% for overhead. A system that is spending trillions. The private insurance system, I'm not here to beat up the private insurance system. It exists. I think it could be a lot better. It takes 25% in administrative overhead. 25 cents of every premium dollar goes for administrative overhead, which contributes nothing. Compared to 3 cents for Medicare. Now, why is Medicare mean the government's more efficient than the private sector? In this case, it is because Medicare is Medicare. It's not 72 policies and 50 billing codes and this unbelievable complexity, which, by the way, has gotten worse since the Affordable Care Act on the private side. And to ask older people to try to navigate this private insurance system, and those of you who've had experience with it know what I'm talking about here, is just nuts and very costly. I don't think the Speaker is going to succeed in this. In fact, I think a lot of the same thing that happened with privatization, or proposed privatization of Social Security is going to happen with Medicare. Now, what about the Affordable Care Act? Well, Republicans are committed to repealing it. but it's now responsible for providing pretty good health care for not just a 20-minute, but one aspect of the Affordable Care Act that nobody seems to talk about is the $10 billion that's been invested in dramatically expanding the community health centers. About 20 million people before the act was passed get their health care from community health centers. That's planned to go to 35 to 40 million. And it's already significantly, I mean, there are millions more that are now getting health care from community health centers as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Something, as they say, people don't really spend a lot of time talking about. So you've got that chunk of folks. You've got the folks that being served by expanded Medicaid. And by the way, the Supreme Court decision declaring that feature of the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional was itself preposterous. I don't know how many times as governor, wasn't the governors love this, 6, 8, 10 times the Congress said to the states, you're going to expand Medicaid and you're going to pay your 50%. They didn't ask our permission. Now, we weren't happy with that. I mean, governors don't like mandates. And anyway, we had to tax for it. They could borrow for it. But nobody, I mean nobody in my 12 years as governor ever suggested that that kind of legislation was unconstitutional. I mean, how many grant aid programs do you think we have in which money flows to the states? If you don't meet the conditions, you don't get the money. And all of a sudden, we get this new doctrine of unconstitutional coercion of the states. Who knew? But we do have, well, maybe 27 states that are now part of this expanded Medicaid thing, including, by the way, states like Ohio, where John Kasich actually, and I don't know how he did it over the opposition of his own Republican legislature. And Ohio now has expanded Medicaid. Well, trying to unravel that is going to be exceedingly difficult. Trust me, letting the insurance companies operate on an interstate basis won't do diddly for expanded coverage. I mean, I don't know who fed that to Trump, but it's absolutely ridiculous. Huh? And, well, it's more than that. I mean, it's this, somehow, interstate insurance again. I mean, nobody believes that. So I think this is going to be a hell of a battle. And you're going to have story after story about people who are all of a sudden no longer getting health care. And how the majority of the Congress deal with that's going to be an interesting question. So, so on the healthcare front, John, I think we'll have a battle over the Medicare thing, but I can't imagine Congress privatizing Medicare. That's kind of an important constituency for one thing. And secondly, I think unraveling the Affordable Care Act is going to be exceedingly difficult. So, you know, hold on to your hat when it comes to this whole thing. And in any event, it's going to be exceedingly slow if, in fact, they try to do it. Because they're not going to impose this kind of punishment on an awful lot of folks. I'll turn the wall over to Steve.
There's some practical challenges that the president-elect will face with the wall. Let me step back and put some context here. The 101 I teach about security to my students for a while, there's sort of 4 axioms of security. The first one is smart security is always nuanced and often counterintuitive, which is why it trips up really bad people. Tough security is always simple, which is why it's politically attractive, and always ineffective in tripping up really bad people. You know, it's pretty straightforward here, right? If you have something very simple, somebody can gain it. But actually there's nuance. You know, they think, oh, I can get away with this, and they trip over it. And it sets off an alarm, you deal with that. So when I try to advance security on any level, that's with a private enterprise or a national level, nuance is a key, and sometimes counterintuitive is another key part. Second axiom, don't overstate threats. Okay, when you overstate a threat, you end up generating kind of the fear-panic response. And panic is both the sense of, well, I'm afraid, but I also feel powerless to deal with what you told me about. And that just doesn't bring out the best in people's judgment. and often it leads to fairly dysfunctional behavior. We call it often panic, right? So it's not. Third one, don't overstate what you can do about the threat. And this is core, I would argue, for a constitutional form of government, where security is the ultimate sort of public good. If you overstate what you can do and then you don't deliver, you grow public confidence. You essentially get folks go, hey, you can't even do your basic function, right? And part of that is this overstating what you can accomplish. Now, often this is done to be reassuring, or a sense of commitment to something. But the downside of it is that almost inevitably, when you again fall short, there's lots of folks there who are basically saying, have a lot of reason to be naysayers. And the last one is very important. Don't alienate the people whose help you need to help you advance security. So we're basically in a world now with the border 4 strikes and you're out. It's a simple sort of one here. It's overstated a problem. We're actually dealing with more migration out than immigration in on the macro numbers right now. So I mean, even the very sort of threat that's supposedly here, particularly given the state of Mexico's demographics and so forth, there's still issues of people crossing the border. But we're not where we were a number of years ago, and all the trends are pointing the other direction. So we overstated a problem that really isn't a real security problem. And then we've always said we can do, obviously, the wall will solve the problem, which when it doesn't, which it won't, then there's going to be a significant erosion again of, hey, we have the silver bullet approach and it worked, which not just bad for the elected officials, it's bad for our constitutional government. Because now we have this other pendulum swing and we couldn't deliver either. And its core, managing the risk that's at the border requires the collaboration and cooperation with your neighbor. Right? The main way we most find problems like terrorists is through intelligence and information sharing. This is why don't alienate the people whose help you need to support you is key. So a lot of what we have to try to manage risk inside the transportation system, within the trade system, within people flows, is done by closely collaborating with our allies and our friends and our neighbors to help us sort through those risks. If we polarize, as it looks like we're going to do, those relationships, you don't get cooperation. And it manifests itself right at the border. The local, basically, police on the Mexican sides, in places like Juarez, or places like Nogales, and Nuevo Laredo, and other places, they won't be able to talk to each other because the governments have sort of pitted themselves in it here. And so you end up with a less security at the end of the day. As a practical issue, it's not just, building a wall is a little tricky. Ask the Chinese, the Romans, they tried that for us. It worked pretty well. It took a little while, but you get a wall there. It doesn't actually work so well. I mean, the challenge here is actually a lot of geography. My colleague can help me out with this here. There's a Rio Grande, so there's a river. There are actually migratory species that move across here. 90% of the border directly adjacent on Texas is privately owned. So you need access to the property to actually do this construction project. I mean, maybe it'll be willing, but you can imagine a few holdouts, who feel like the Fed should not be here. I mean, this is really not simple stuff. So he's going to bump into that reality early on, and there's going to be other stuff on the plate. So I suspect this is one that actually will be it worked well for the politics of fear and kind of get where he is, but I don't see the enthusiasm to kind of make it all happen.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Steve, you brought up earlier the transition, which you've had some experience with from Bush to Obama, and so some people will argue, they'll say, well, the bureaucracy in its various forms, with several million people, employees that are kind of on a particular track, that will be a check on an administration that wants to go in radically different directions? Is that a viable check, or is that not an expectation that people is realistic?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's enormous inertia, right? I mean, it'd be very difficult for most of the practical issues that happen from the government standpoint. There are a lot of rules. We operate by a lot of rules. We're going to get lawyers in here to sort of drive the kind of change. I mean, so let's just take the basic one here. I mean, there are 8,000 ICE agents, and there are, we're throwing the number around, about 11 million people that we want to leave the country. But we have due process when you're actually inside the country. We can't just sort of grab you in the middle of the night and hurl you over the border. So boy, we're gonna need a lot of immigration judges. And how's that gonna work? And, you know, we got a lot of cities in the country who basically said, you want them, good luck, right? I mean, that's the many of our major cities, and I think appropriately, this should not be a priority of a local city dealing with here. Talk about undermining community policing, instead of dealing with those core issues, is a perfectly legitimate case for any local city, major city or state to say, you feds want to deal with this issue, knock yourself out. So with so much of this, I just see that, you know, he's going to run up to the fact that basically governing is hard. And in most, it's not very sexy. And that may be frustrating for a lot of a big swath of the public who voted for him, but sorry, it's a modern age, it's kind of the way it works.
Well, and also go back to Jenny, you were mentioning about renewable energy, kind of the train left the station, I think you said. So that's an area where you think change will happen regardless of what happens at the federal level? I mean, are the states playing a role there? Some states anyway, perhaps? Or what's the dynamic that leads you to say that's going to move forward either way?
Yeah. So I'm not diminishing the role that federal government may play in kind of changing the dynamic to some degree. But yes, there is, the states are playing a big role, local communities and cities and towns are already investing and interested in engaging and installing renewables. You know, the market is a global market too. So we have Germany that has a national policy for a renewable energy transition, getting rid of fossil fuels and nuclear. And China leading the way in terms of you know, technology, and the rest of the world is going to be continuing. We are also going to be continuing. I don't know what the impact of enhanced and accelerated fossil fuel extraction that's been proposed is going to have. You know, it could have an indirect or direct impact on the renewable transition, obviously. But ultimately, on some larger time scale and on a larger scale, the world is transitioning away from fossil fuels. So in that I guess that's the message that I am kind of sticking with, and I think offers some again some optimism. And as I mentioned, renewables. If President-elect is serious about energy independence, which is a phrase he has used, then renewable energy makes so much sense, right? Because each city, town, community can have their own energy source locally. So there's huge potential there.
And the private sector is into this big time.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
I don't know how many of you saw that story. I listened to the Times yesterday saying that Google is going to be, or at least a substantial chunk of Google's energy needs are going to be entirely renewable by next year. So they're kind of ahead of the curve as well. It's kind of interesting.
Let me get a time check here.
We have probably 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. We just have to be done at 7:45, so we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A.
Okay, that's good. Let me ask a different sort of question. I was reading a Globe editorial the other day, and they were talking about kind of ex-presidents and kind of what they do. So I'm moving away from Trump, going back to Obama here. I'm just curious what your thoughts are. The editorial was kind of comparing, looking at John Quincy Adams. People remember what he did after he left the presidency. Anyone know what he did? He became a member of Congress. So he exercised voice and kept going. Other people have said ex-presidents should not be heard from. They should kind of, go to the ranch, whatever it is, and not be heard from. Thoughts on what should President Obama do? And this is clearly going to be some big changes here. What do you think soon-to-be former President Obama should do?
Well, a lot of people have said that Obama appreciates the fact that George W. Bush did not get in this role.
That's right.
And Obama feels very strongly about that. I find it very difficult to believe that Obama will remain silent for the next 4 years, if in fact what we think we're going to get out of this administration is what's going to happen. And he's going to have to decide, John, I think, what's appropriate, how often he does this. But I don't think he's going back to the branch.
Okay. Jenny, go ahead. Jenny.
Well, I was just gonna say, I'd heard that he had been thinking about electoral reform issues, previously. I think that was kind of on his plate. But similarly, I think it would be very hard to not be engaged, in this new dynamic that we're in.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he's such a gentleman, almost too much of a, I think that sometimes. But the need for an alternative narrative to something that's easier, I think he's going to find somewhat irresistible. I have to say on some of the core issues here, as we move to all year, I think this is a time where universities need to be all in when it comes to actually helping the world sort through very complex issues and grounding it in the facts and analysis and so forth. This is where we really need to step up our game, not in any partisan way, but in terms of obviously clearly playing the role of helping people navigate through this challenging time. And so, to some extent, I think this is kind of a wake-up call for some of us who may be in our world a little bit complacent, and realize that this is a time where our work is enormously important and serious. Most of these folks were former students of somebody who are writing things here, and so we really got to get this right, and the kind of support that all of you show to help us, be able to have the means to be able to do that well. I think this is a time where leadership is absolutely essential, and I think universities have a very important role to play in that.
Okay. Thank you. Let me open it up for questions. Questions for, yes?
I have a question for Jenny.